we're going to look at Milton Sonnets. Oh, by the way, before I begin, I mentioned last time Robert Graves, The Greek Myths, here in 2 volumes, paperback. Really useful reference work if you want something that's going to help you with Greek mythology. I think you will find this indispensable. So, for example, there are various creation myths in the ancient world. There's those that are from the Pelasgian creation myth. There's the Homeric and Orphic creation myth. There's the Olympian creation myths. And then there are 2 philosophical creation myths. And then the discussion of, and it will not only recount what they are in quite a succinct and helpful manner, it will give you the sources for them so that you can go read them in the original. So if you're finding authors that you're not recognizing in Milton, which will be a lot of them, you'll find this quite a useful book. It'll take you to that, and it'll give you a little background. I mean, you can always do Google searches, but Google is actually less useful than this, I can tell you. And if you want to go to the original text, then sometimes you can see that Milton is doing things with the original text that you wouldn't have known had you not gone to the original text. And we'll see that today, for instance. But these sonnets, I talked about the form in Milton, preparing him for the great work that he thought that he was preordained to write, namely the great grand epic, which turned out to be Paradise Lost, and using his early career as a writer to prepare for that. And one of the forms that he used is that of the sonnet. Now, the sonnet, let me just say a few things about that, and then we'll look at Milton's sonnets. The sonnet is not an ancient form at all. It does not exist in the classical world. It is a modern form. When I say modern, 14th century modern. But Renaissance, then, established and made famous by Francesco Petrarch, and thereby and therewith connected ever after, although not exclusively, but certainly in its early beginnings, with the courtly love traditions that Petrarch appeals to regularly. Dante will write them, Spenser will write them, Donne will write them, Shakespeare, even more famously, will write them. And Milton tries his hand at them as well. So it is, and a sonnet means literally a little room. It's a 14-line poem. Very brief and succinct. It's not quite an epigram, longer than that, but it still is a very compact form in which there tends to be condensed thought. And usually 1, 2, or 3 movements to it, depending on what sort one writes. So in Petrarch, there's an octave, 8 lines, and then a sestet, 6 lines, and so there tend to be 2 sort of movements. Under Shakespeare, we get him writing 3 quatrains and then concluding with a rhyming couplet. Spenser lies somewhat in between the 2. And Milton and other 17th century writers will experiment with the rhyme scheme, the lineation, and so forth. It's always 14 lines. But they'll explore and use the form and try different things. And one of the things that they change are the courtly love traditions. It's still there in the background, but sometimes it'll be playing with the courtly love traditions, or it will be applying them to the lover and God, as in Donne's holy sonnets. So there's already the established convention of love poetry, but Donne reconfigures it in terms that are already established in Christian thought, that sees the soul as the individual component of the bride of Christ, the church, and the lover of the soul and the church being Jesus Christ. So that dynamic there, Donne explores and does so quite brilliantly. Milton moves away from that a bit, and we'll see that here with the first sonnet we're going to look at, Sonnet 13. I think I prescribed about a dozen of them. We're not going to look at them all in detail. I just wanted you to read them to get a sense of them. I'll look at the more famous of them. But I'll start off with 13, which is not among the more famous of them, just to see some of the differences. I think I've thrown it up here as well. in part because the footnotes are useful. But let me read it, and then we'll make a few comments and proceed thereafter. Harry, whose tuneful and well-measured song first taught our English music how to span words with just note and accent, not to scan with Midas ears, committing short and long. Thy worth and skill exempt thee from the throng, with praise enough for envy to look wan. To after age thou shalt be writ the man that with smooth air couldst humour best our tongue. Thou honour'st verse, and verse must lend her wing to honour thee, the priest of Phoebus' choir, that tunes their happiest lines in hymn or story. Dante shall give fame leave to set thee higher than his Casella, whom he wooed to sing, met in the milder shades of purgatory. Question, what sort of sonnet is this? Do you know? Whose model is he following here? So the rhyme scheme is A, B, B, A, song, span, scan, long, throng, wan, man, tongue. Same thing. Repeat it twice, right? So,
Is it the Italian Petrarchan?
Yeah, so the Petrarchan. So this is an octave. And then after tongue, there's a shift in rhyme scheme, but also a shift in the object of contemplation. And it's related to the foregoing, but it's taking it in a slightly different direction, just like an essay will. So you're building on what has been established there and digressing slightly. So thou honors first, and verse must lead her wings. So C, choir, D, story, E, higher, sing purgatory. C, D, E, D, C. So inverts it, right? Or no, wrong. Story and purgatory. So C, D, E, and then E, D, C. So it's got two parts. He's writing about Henry Lawes, who wrote the music for his the play that we've already looked at, The Mask. And so this is a dedication to a musician. And remember, The Mask was about chastity. So it's a love poem. Almost immediate, whenever you read a sonnet, you think love poem. But now it's to the musician who wrote the score, if you will, to Milton's play on chastity. So a particular type of love. Not the refraining from love per so much as the right direction of the soul towards God in all things. But he first taught our English music how to span words with just note and accent, not to scan. This is helpful. So span is giving the words the correct measure of length and stress, and scanning is to count them. And then he makes a reference to Midas ears, and I think you can see here the allusion here. And if you wanted to, in Graves, we probably could look up Midas, and it would tell the story of that. I'm not going to waste the time to do that, but it will be there. And so that's why I recommend you buy it. It's useful not only for Milton, but you'll find for later authors. The mythology is really a potent and rich treasure for authors to mine and use for their own works. And we're not acquainted with the mythology ourselves. At least I speak for myself. I assume that you are also not well acquainted with Greek mythology. And there's more than Greek mythology. There's Norse mythology and so forth as well. There's a lot of mythology, a lot of stories. And the stories tend to be held that they have some sort of a significance to the stories. They're not just fashionable. There's a proverbial aspect to them. But the Midas ears when Pan competed with Apollo in song, only Midas, king of Phrygia, preferred Pan's music, and Apollo punished him by changing his ears to those of an ass, which will remind us of what? Midsummer Night's Dream, right? And that will be in Shakespeare's mind, by the way. Renaissance authors would all have read Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's one of the core texts of the medieval period. So if you want to read Shakespeare and understand him, you will also want to avail yourself of Ovid, or at the very least, this little synopsis by Robert Graves. So he gave it not to scan with Midas ears, committing short and long, so with big floppy ears, and not switching the words to suit the music, but rather switching the music to suit the words. Now, this is a theme that Milton is keenly interested in, and he's really that this is a debate whether when playing music your words should conform to the music or vice versa. Because remember we said even when discussing music, music is thought to be something that is inherent in the fabric of the cosmos. So there's a case to be made for music being the true thing, the real thing, and words ought to conform to its pattern. Milton comes down on the side rather of the importance of the word, and he does so to some degree as a reformer. So even music ought to follow words, and you will see this most famously in Paradise Lost, where he writes an unrhymed blank verse against the conventions of his day. They wrote in rhyming couplets, but Milton does not. He says, I'm not going to do that, and it's the product of a barbarous age to do so, by which he means his own. We've fallen away from what is truly important, namely the telling of the story, and subsumed it under musical concerns. Words are more important than that. But note that Harry is being praised precisely because he has done this with Milton's own work. And again, it's a love song. Now thy worth and skill exempts thee from the throng, with praise enough for envy to look wan, pale. To after age thou shalt be writ, the man that with smooth air couldst humour best our tongue. So high praise. He adapts music to the English language. And again, this is the age in which not only is the Bible being translated into the vernacular, whether English or German or whatever, but other texts are. People are writing in the vernacular. They're not only writing in Latin. Milton writes Paradise Lost in English. We may find that unremarkable, but it is sort of remarkable in the day. Like, why would Milton write Paradise Lost not in Latin, as confident and competent as he is in the Latin tongue, and it's the language of the literate, and it's a highly intellectual poem in many ways with its allusions and so forth. He nonetheless writes it in English. How come? Again, it's the Protestant dynamic, the importance of words to all people, and therefore the word is preeminent even in his understanding of how music ought to fit with that. Bit of a broader discussion, but I just think it's worthy of note. So thou honorest verse being poetry, and verse must lend her wing to honor thee, the priest of Phoebus' choir, that tunes their happiest lines in hymn or story. Dante shall give fame leave to set thee higher than his Casella. Now Casella, it says in the footnote here, is a Florentine musician. So he's comparing a famous poet and the musician who wrote music to accompany that with this fellow. Obviously, Mr. Milton is thereby making the comparison between himself and Dante. As I say, Mr. Milton does not lack confidence. Or is it a sense simply of vocation? He believes very strongly from an early age that he was called by God to write this. So why would he doubt himself if he has that certitude? But it sounds rather extraordinary, at least to my ears, that a man writes a few centuries later and vies with Dante before he's even written his epic. Remember, Dante writes an epic. So he's courting comparison here. And Dante also writes sonnets, by the way. and writes them as love poetry. But note here, he is exalting the word and chastity and the importance of the heart's right relation to God in all things. That is a sort of love poetry. And he fits that theme of the soul's right relation to God to a form of writing that is meant for love. It sounds a little abstract, but it's more less abstract than theological. And once again, connected to the importance of the word. So it's Christocentric, and this is one of the marks of the Reformation, is its high emphasis on Christology. The focus on the person and work of Jesus Christ. It's not that Christ is not important in Roman Catholicism, but the emphasis on Christ's atonement is front and center. And the importance of the word, read and also preached, in bringing people from death to life and so forth. Now here, his Casella, whom he wooed to sing, met in the milder shades of purgatory. Note that he doesn't denounce the doctrine of purgatory here, although Milton will not ascribe to it. He thinks it's a Catholic doctrine for which there is no basis in Scripture. He'll follow the reformers on that. Note that there's no purgatory in Milton's Paradise Lost. He goes to the underworld, but there's no Mount Purgatory in there. It's just gone. Here he's just making the comparison. How much greater is this fellow then? Not meeting him in purgatory, meeting him on earth where heaven meets. So comments or questions? I don't want to spend too much time on this particular sonnet. But yes?
Sonnets, they're usually love sonnets, but are they usually love as in eros or love as in philia, or another kind of love?
Good question. So the question is related to different understandings of what love means, made well known by C.S. Lewis. So if you're doing the C.S. Lewis course, I don't think Dr. Davis will deal with this probably, actually. If we do a C.S. Lewis course next year, and I do it, we will do it. The Four Loves. Have you read the Four Loves, any of you? Some of you? Okay, good. So he talks about four types of love, and he uses there are the Greek words for that. So he talks about storge, first of all, which is familiar love. Like, I love my chair or something. Like, or I love something familiar and comfortable. Like, you can love your surroundings. I love my bed. I mean, we'll say that in English, which you really don't have romantic attractions to your bed. It's just like there's a familiarity to it. You can love your home and surroundings. And he says this is a real type of love, and it's part of what makes our world a habitable place, is that we love the things that are all around us. But he calls that storge. Second type, he calls philia. Friendship is a sort of love, much prized in the ancient world. Aristotle writes a great deal about friendship. And once again, I think Lewis's definition of it is people who love one another in a friendly fashion don't look at one another. They stand shoulder to shoulder and look in the same direction. So your friends like what you like. You do things together, and there's a strong bond and relationship there, but it's not one where you're looking at your friend and loving your friend. You and your friend together are loving something else, and not a woman or a man. It's a thing, or an activity or whatever, right? So there's a friendship that can be established here. Characteristic of a university, there's a sort of a friendship, a solidarity that arises out of it, and it's a real thing. Particularly if it's friendship based on something that is of the intellect, something that lasts and so forth. Second type. Third type is the one that you mentioned, eros. We would call this romantic love, the attraction to the opposite sex. or sexual love, because I guess it doesn't have to be the opposite sex. But it would be sexual attraction. This would be erotic love. That sort of thing. And the fourth and final type would be agape love. Yeah. Which is a sort of a love for God, or the peculiar love that God bestows upon us, for which there is no real correspondence. And chastity may be of that sort. It's less than erotic love. It's the love of God that helps us restrain ourselves from erotic love, for instance, or misapplied erotic love. But it's particularly the case in the love that God bears towards us, which is an object that doesn't deserve his affection. This is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and gave his son as a propitiation for our sins. So that sort of love. So it's almost, there is no human correlate to it, other than response to God's initiating agape love. Those four types of things. So what's the question again? Sorry, now that I digressed infinitely, and it was a clever question. Have you forgotten the question now? Sorry. Yes, after that terrible digression.
Does this sonnet, and do most sonnets, are they referring to eros, or are they referring to philia? Obviously this one
Can be all. It can be any, and it could be all.
Is there any sort of traditional?
The traditional is eros.
Okay.
Yes.
Like I'm thinking Shakespearean sonnets, which are almost all eros, and so.
Yes, and they're following Petrarch in that. So the love for a lady in Petrarch.
But it doesn't per se have to be eros.
No, and again, later, because of the richness of the senses of love, later writers will expand on those. In particular, talk about the love of God, the agape love.
So with Sonnet 13, was it more of a bold or unprecedented move that he was writing it to a friend, or was that already established in his time?
Well, Shakespeare's already written about friendship, although he tends to write about erotic love. He talks about a dark youth. Some people think it's homoerotic. I have my doubts about that, but you can make the case. There's a rich tradition of love of man for his fellow man, by which I mean masculine, going back all the way to David and Jonathan and so forth. Again, some people see that as homoerotic. I don't. Myself, I don't think that's either necessary or even warranted by the text. They just love one another in the way you may have experienced of your friends. You love your friends. It's an ardent affection, but it's not that. In general, all of these different loves, by the way, can become perverted as well and distorted. But here, I don't know if it's unique, but again, very Miltonic to take it in a different direction for sure. Yeah, and he's writing about a friend who's got the same views that he does, but he's also writing it about a friend who set his work, Comus, to music, and again, Comus was about chastity, so it's a type of human response to divine love. So it's a bit of both, right? So he is, but that's already happened, I think, in Donne and the metaphysical poets. They will regularly do that sort of thing. So it's not unique. And it will become increasingly less unique, because other writers will certainly write about the love of a dog or something in a sonnet or something, like, or a good old book that's well worn.
Well, like, you can even see it in the ancient epics like Achilles and Patroclus. They had this brotherly love even though they were like cousins.
They're cousins, yeah.
Again, that's debate. People debate that, but
that's because the modern world simply cannot accept that there can be love for another person that's not sexual in nature. They do the same thing with C.S. Lewis and Mrs. Moore, right? If you know anything about his biography. So he has a pact with his friend who's in the trenches. If either of us dies, we'll look after one another's parents. Okay, so, and Patty Moore gets killed, so Lewis takes her in, and they live together for 30-odd years, and biographers now think that they must have had a sexual relationship. There's no basis for it. other than it's impossible for them to imagine that a young man could live with a woman who he had affection for without it becoming that. At least to my knowledge, there's no basis for it. But again, we just find it inconceivable. When I say we, the modern world, I object myself. But then I'm an anachronism, so there you go. Not that I don't see the nature of the problem, but I just, why does it have to be that? Let's skip over 14, and we'll skip over the Sonnet 12 there, and then, oh, it's all over the place. Okay. Yes, that's why I put these up here. And these are Psalms, and there's Sonnet. Okay, 15. So this is page 227. Now, these were not published at the time, but this is to Lord Fairfax. Now, Fairfax was the commander-in-chief of the parliamentary armies. He was a nobleman. In general, the nobility would have thrown themselves with the royal party, but Fairfax recognized the legitimacy of the parliamentary forces, and because he was part of the aristocratic establishment, he became a very potent symbol of the injustice done by the royal. So even one of the most important noblemen of the kingdom is going to rebel, not just those who are the lesser individuals, but even one of the foremost men of the day is going to fight against the king. And he was much praised for this. An important figure, by the way. One thing that Fairfax did not do is he didn't agree with the execution of Charles I. He would take no part in it. He retired when that happened. So he was willing to fight against the king in order to bring him to account, but he was not willing to have him executed. At the point he did that, he said, this will bring about anarchy. Where will this end? And he retires to his own estate. And he has a poet working with him by the name of Andrew Marvell, who writes about him a great deal as well. Must have been a great man. And Marvell is the one who intercedes on Milton's behalf when Charles II is restored and Milton is blind and they want to chop off Milton's head. Marvell intercedes and says, you know, what's he going to do? He's blind. Just leave him alone. And the consequence of that is he writes Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistics. But anyway, but Fairfax is the leader of the parliamentary army, the commander-in-chief, and ends the Second Civil War. There's a series of them. This is the end of it. But so it's if a poem, a sonnet is a love poem, this is the love of a famous man. It's a sort of philia. He loves him for what he did. Fairfax, whose name in arms through Europe rings, filling each mouth with envy or with praise, and all her jealous monarchs with amaze, and rumors loud that daunt remotest kings. Thy firm, unshaken virtue ever brings victory home, though new rebellions raise their hydra heads, and the false north displays her broken league, to imp her serpent wings. Oh, yet a nobler task awaits thy hand, for what can wars but endless war still breed, till truth and right from violence be freed, and public faith cleared from the shameful brand of public fraud? In vain doth valor bleed, while avarice and rapine share the land. So Fairfax is seen as a conquering general, commander-in-chief, who has committed great deeds in war, martial means. Remember, Milton is not averse to military endeavors. That's part of his tractate of education, that one should be able to wield the sword to defend one's house and one's country. And Fairfax is a representation of this sort of Renaissance man, but talks about the consequence, after the Second Civil War was over, a new rebellion arises in the ranks. First it rises in Scotland and then in Ireland. So after the Presbyterians, who fought alongside, and the Scottish were Presbyterians, fought alongside the English in defeating Charles I, once that was over, then they had a fight over what sort of church government was going to be imposed. And the Scots said it should be Presbyterians everywhere. And the English said there should be freedom on this. So Cromwell in chief said, no, we're not going to impose a form of church government on the populace. There should be freedom of conscience. So he allows for episcopacy, allows for Presbyterians, and allows for Congregationalist polities. Cromwell was probably Congregationalist, but was willing to allow for differences within the Commonwealth that he established. But the Scots didn't agree. They thought, no, this was about truth, and the true form of church government as laid down in Scripture is Presbyterian, therefore it's going to be Presbyterian. When Cromwell says, no, we're not going to do that, there's a rebellion in the north. Good old Scots. And then Cromwell goes up and cracks some heads together, for which he is not well liked in Scotland, needless to say. Even less well liked in Ireland. But that's another story. This is about the north and the Presbyterians in the north. And as I say, it says here, and I think this is rightly in the note, he will not attack Scotland unless they invade. So a just war theory. He ascribes to it. Unless we are attacked and are under threat, I will not invade that country, even though they're threatening to invade us. Once they do it, I will respond, but not until that point. So Fairfax is a man of restraint, a model of that, which Milton highly prizes. Nothing wrong with war, other than that it's horrifying. But if the conditions warrant it, then I guess it's a necessary evil. But if they don't warrant it, then do not go into it, and Fairfax will not go into it. What is the nobler task then that he envisages here? Because he mentions that in verse 9. For what can wars but endless wars still breed? Well, till truth and right from violence be freed, and public faith cleared from the shameful brand of public fraud, in vain doth valor bleed, while avarice and rapine share the land. So there needs to be the restoration of truth and right without imposing it by the sword. You can't make men good by coercion. They need to do it voluntarily. God hath left free the will. This is a consistent theme in Milton, in all of his works. You can't make people do good things. You can stop them from doing bad things by coercion. There is a place for that, but you can't actually make them good without them desiring to be good. And that can't come by force of arms. So he admires Fairfax, who the military man, precisely because he will not invade the Scots. Eventually it will happen, as I say. But that's when they invade England. So it says there right at the bottom in the footnote, after having entered into the solemn league and covenant with Parliament on September 25th, 1643, the Scots broke the league by invading England in August under James, Duke of Hamilton. Since joining, the parliamentarians had impaired her usually serpentine wings. Milton is saying Scotland has now imped them, that is, repaired them by inserting new feathers through a return to treacherous action. So there you go. Comments or questions? Again, it's a sonnet and therefore a love poem, but clearly nothing to do with romantic love. I don't think anyone can make that argument here. Not agape love, it's admiration, philia. The admiration that a virtuous man bears for another virtuous man. He loves what is true and right above all things. Now, I don't see that in Donne. Donne is, most of Donne's, even his love poetry, his holy sonnets are highly sexual in nature. Not a hint of that here. So Milton is taking it in a different direction, without a doubt. Comments or questions? I'll move on to 16 if there are none. It's hot in here. On Mr. Cromwell. Now Cromwell is the head, ends up being the head of the Republican force and the protector-in-chief of the new Commonwealth. As time goes by, he becomes more and more invested in royal trappings. But when they defeat the king, they say that we're going to have a republic, no longer a monarchy. So this is not a fight like the War of the Roses for one aristocrat to displace another and put the crown on his head and say, now I'm the king. He doesn't do that. He seeks to allow freedom from restraint and suppression. Anyway, Cromwell, in the same sort of vein as Fairfax. Cromwell, our chief of men, who through a cloud not of war only, but detractions rude, guided by faith and matchless fortitude, to peace and truth thy glorious way hast plowed. And on the neck of crowned fortune proud hast reared God's trophies and his work pursued. While Darwin's stream with blood of Scots imbrued, and Dunbar field resounds thy praises loud, and Worcester's laureate wreath. Yet much remains to conquer still. Peace hath her victories, no less renowned than war. New foes arise, threatening to bind our souls with secular chains. Help us to save free conscience from the paw of hireling wolves, whose gospel is their maw. Maw is the wolf's mouth. So there are different threats, spiritual threats that will now arise. Cromwell is so it's similar to the Fairfax poem, insofar as he envisages a place where vigilance is equally needed and combat is equally needed, but not of the martial sort, not with a sword. And the chief thing that needs to be defended is freedom. Freedom of speech, and freedom from, again, the prelates who are wanting to impose a type of church government on the entire country. So to this day, although it's not so common, there's the established church in England, the Anglican church, and then there's the dissenter. Presbyterians, Baptists. So I was called a dissenter when I was there by the head of my college. There you go. Which I didn't know. I had no idea it was dissenting. I said, what am I dissenting from? Well, I guess the Anglican legitimacy. I thought, okay, well, I guess I am. I'm not an Anglican. As much as I like aspects of it, I'm not one. And Cromwell, Milton supports Cromwell in allowing for freedom of conscience. He sees it as an all-important thing. Amongst men who are, men and women who are born again. So amongst Christians, there needs to be freedom. It's not absolute freedom. He's not giving this freedom to people who deny the gospel, who are denying. He's not going to give it. Although, interestingly, in Scotland, they allowed the Jews to come back to England. Actually, let's stop that. And to this day, the Presbyterians and Jewish people work rather well. It's quite an interesting phenomenon, that. But Cromwell also allows the Jews back. So they'd been dispelled under the Roman Catholics. There's a long-standing tradition of the persecution of the Jews throughout Catholic Europe. One of the things that Cromwell does early on is he invites the English Jews back into the country and allows them to worship as they see fit, which I think is rather extraordinary in his day. And Milton would approve, and did approve. So again, if it's a love sonnet, it's a love sonnet that's clearly not dealing with erotic love. It's not dealing with storge or familiar love. It's not really dealing with agape love, other than the importance of freedom for responding to agape love, because God does not compel us or coerce us. He frees the will from sin and calls upon us to love him in return. So it's a freedom for the gospel. So there's a gospel-centered hermeneutic behind Milton's sonnets. And it needs a political manifestation through freedom of speech, which he's argued about in Areopagitica. Some of you are going to write on that topic. But this is a poem to it and to the man that is going to ensure that it happens. Although remember, Areopagitica failed, but still. Because Parliament was against it, and Cromwell thought, now again, Cromwell may believe that there ought to be freedom of speech, but if he is genuinely a Republican and is going to allow other people to have input into the reign or the running of the kingdom, even if his personal view is this, he's going to demonstrate that he allows freedom of conscience by allowing people to disagree with him, which he then does. So a great deal more freedom there than you would find anywhere in this day. Comments or questions? Do you like the sonnets? I find them easy to read. They're not, other than perhaps some of the names, but I mean the footnotes will help us with that, and then they're very easy to read. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because of their length, even if you are confused like the first time reading, the second time reading through, by the third, you're starting to understand more what.
It's a lack of familiarity with names, maybe, but there's no conceptual problems per se, particularly once you're starting to follow Milton's train of thought, which you are by now. That's actually one of the reasons why I do the short poems before we come to the longer poems, that it helps. I realize the shorter poems are challenging, but they were written in a certain order, which I think is important when studying any figure, but also I think they sort of lead you into his train of thought, which you can see from his very early days. He's not moved from his themes. He's very consistent in his convictions. But liberty, so the names like the Darwin stream, Dunbar, and Worcester's laureate wreath. Okay, you might not know that Darwin was a stream in Scotland. You might not know where Dunbar Field is, but a footnote will soon betray that, and then there's no real challenge there. Right? Easy enough to follow. But note that he wants free conscience from the paw of hireling wolves whose gospel is their maw. Now, these are the very same individuals, the priests, who he castigates in Lycidas. Right? So again, common theme. Gospel ministers who, in fact, are only interested in fattening their own stomachs and do not give or preach the word of God to the people who are hungry for it. Note that Milton's concern for truth is preeminent here as ever. Consistent. For freedom to flourish, or for the truth to flourish, freedom is sort of a necessary precondition. It's also possible for the truth to be proclaimed in chains. But would you rather have it in chains or in freedom? Most people say I'd rather have it in freedom. It's one of the consequences of it. Anyway, so, okay, then I will move on. I'm going to skip over Sonnet 17. And he does a variety of psalms, which I think are interesting. And we'll pick it up at Sonnet 18. Famous sonnet. It's not given a title in your book, but it is on the overhead here, and it's often given this title in anthologies. So it's on the late Massacre in Piedmont. This is in Italy, where Protestant reformers were massacred by Catholics. It's an infamous passage. So the Vaudois, as it says in the footnote 2, the descendants of the Waldenses, lived in the foothills of the Alps. And they have lived in accordance with their conscience for a long time, and in the midst of the this period, there's a great bloodletting, which was not uncommon in the period. So in the 30 Years' War, there were all sorts of massacres that took place in France as well. Henry IV, 10,000, I think, Protestants were massacred in Paris in one day. But if the sonnet's a love poem, how are we to read this then? Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold. Even them who kept thy truth so pure of old, when all our fathers worshipped stocks and stones. Forget not, in thy book record their groans, who were thy sheep and in their ancient fold, slain by the bloody Piemontese that rolled mother with infant down the rocks. Their moans the vales redoubled to the hills, and they to heaven. Their martyred blood and ashes sow o'er all the Italian fields, where still doth sway the triple tyrant, that from these may grow 100-fold, who having learnt thy way, early may fly the Babylonian woe. It's eschatological in its overtones, or apocalyptic, references to the book of Revelation. Parallels probably reside in the imprecatory psalms. Avenge your people, O Lord. That same spirit. Now, it's a funny old thing for a sonnet, but if we already have established that the sonnet is a means for the peculiar love of God for his people, then it isn't too far a stretch. But note that Milton is not going to separate, although there's a distinction, between politics and religion. There's a political expression of religious conviction, which any free country will permit. He sees it as essential. But in this case, as I say, in Catholic Italy, the Catholic Church of the day and the Pope of the day ordered the massacre of the Piemontese, spoken of here as the triple tyrant. I'm not quite sure why the triple tyrant.
Would you put the number 3? The number 3 is biblical significant.
It is, but it's usually positive. It's Trinity. There is an infernal trinity in Paradise Lost, but that's not a common convention at this stage. And I'm not quite sure what he means by that, I have to confess. But he sees the battle, and this is again characteristic of his day, sees the combat of his day as expressions of the kingdom of God, the city of Jerusalem, and on the other hand, Babylon the Great. And Babylon the Great is represented by the Pope, the Antichrist. That's how he's referred to in Protestant documents in this day. So he's an earthly manifestation of those that oppose Christ, therefore the Antichrist. And there can be more than one, although it depends on who you're reading, but that would be the understanding. So these conflicts are not just conflicts between factions or men. These are spiritual battles taking place through the instruments of people and nations. And they're fighting over truth. I think that discussions like these are very foreign to most of us. But they were not foreign to people that operated before the First World War. As I said in my sci-fi subcreation course, both the Germans and the Allies thought they were fighting for God, on God's behalf. From the pulpits of certain, particularly liberal Protestant churches, they were encouraged to take the fight to their enemies in the name of progress, and progress is advancing the kingdom of God. So it begs the question of what you mean by progress, but in that day it was social Darwinism, so that the German folk would prevail over their enemies. You get similar sorts of language from the English and from the Americans, and from Canada you get the same sorts of things. So people being encouraged to go for war, to fight the infidel, the godless Germans, the Huns. So this language does not go away until the 20th century with the bloody battles that go with it, and now we're intensely uncomfortable with it. You think of it more in relation to Islam. And if Christians talk about this, most Christians will go crazy. And that's partly because of the experience of 2 world wars, I submit. Not just because of their allegiance to Christianity, but more because of 2 senseless, brutal world wars. It sort of broke the spirit of the Western powers. But that's off topic. I'm just saying here, Milton's expressions of battles that are really partaking of a theological or spiritual conflict is very common. You get the same thing in Catholic writing of the medieval period when talking about the Crusades. There'd be the same sort of thing. I say the 30 Years' War, the battle between Protestants and Catholic, was the beginning of the moving away, the beginning of the departure from that. It took a long time. I wish they would stop that. Anything about this that you would like me to expand upon?
You had the footnote for triple tyrant. What does it say?
I don't. Is it here? Oh, it's here.
On the computer there's
Thank you.
a footnote
You're right.
there.
Okay. Good. Triple crown instead of a mitre.
It's a boat reference.
Or the threefold threat posed to the English by the Irish, the French, and the Italian Catholic armies under the Duke of Savoy. So in other words, nobody knows. But you have to conjecture. I mean, as I said, it's not an established convention to call him the triple tyrant. It's his own personal association there. So it could refer to there's a crown, and then there's a shorter crown, and there's a little crown. Sometimes wearing that. Yeah. No idea. But when there's no idea, that's when the scholars go to work. You can write an article on that. That's, for sure. And then somebody else can write a counter article because that person really couldn't prove that, and this is why that's wrong. Then you get a counter to a counter, and there you go, publications. Publication. More famously, other comments or questions, I'll come to the more, and maybe the most famous of his sonnets, which is 19. And you may have read this one before. It's sometimes called On His Blindness. Because as I said before, in his middle age, Milton lost his sight. It started going slowly and eventually was gone altogether. here he reflects on it as a theme of biblical proportions. And there's a widespread resonance with blind writers and prophets throughout world history. But Homer was said to be blind, sometimes called Maimonides, the same figure. Homer was said to be blind. Tiresias the prophet was blind. St. Paul was struck blind. And in their ranks, among the more famous, Mr. Milton was blind. And yet prolific and prophetic in the midst of that. So there's something about you're deprived of one thing and recompensed with another gift. So the gift that he'd been given early on, the capacity to write wonderfully, is almost amplified by his loss of another gift, the gift of sight. Remember, one of the symptoms of sin in the Gospels is blindness. So people who are blind are considered to be sinners. So are those who are deaf, and so are those who are lame. Everybody assumes that these people are cursed by God. It's a symptom of sin. So when Jesus comes and he heals the blind, the lame, the deaf, it's not just curing them of an ailment, it's a sign that he has power over sin and is reversing the bad effects of it. So it's important. Just like when he walks on the water, it's not just an extraordinary act, it's a symptom. Remember, the sea that he walks on is a symbol of evil. It's again a demonstration of who he is and what his ministry is there to do, which is to destroy sin and death. Remember, sin leads to death. So the Lord of life will triumph over sin and death. So with all that in mind, and again with the resonance of light, when I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my Maker, and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labor, light denied? I fondly ask. But patience to prevent that murmur soon replies. God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mighty yoke, his mild yoke? They serve him best. His state kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. I think the context of his life, it adds a great deal of power to the poem. If you know of his biography and his discussion of his sense of vocation to write a grand epic poem, and the fact that he spent many years in service, political service, for Cromwell's Republic, not writing that poem, and then loses his sight in the midst of that, you can imagine his sense of frustration, but also the sense that he's not done the thing that he was called to do. And he is fearful because he will have to give an account for his life. And in his case, God had called him, he believed, to write an epic poem. And he hasn't done it. And he will be judged for it. It's moving when you consider that he writes this poem before he writes Paradise Lost. And he concludes it with, they also serve who only stand and wait. He's got to wait, feeling helpless, unable to write, when he'd been given the great gift to write. And we'll see that aspect and God's complete power in his life, overcoming his circumstances. We'll see that in Paradise Lost and in Paradise Regained, and even in Samson Agonistes. Remember Samson, who does the Lord's work when he's blinded. And he does it by destroying evil. That's how the book of Judges portrays Samson. He brings down the big temple on top of his head and on all of his enemies, the enemies of Israel. But he begins with a reflection, which I think we could all identify with in some ways, which is how do you spend your days? In his case, again, he's writing it in his middle age. He's been doing things which he thought were important and necessary, but he's not done the one thing which he felt called to do. This is not a good feeling. And there's a talent which he's been given. Now, the parable of the talents, you're aware of. Everyone is given talents. Talent is a coin. Here he uses it in the usual English sense of an ability or a gift of peculiar capacity, and he believes he has a very unique one. So he can't do it. It's useless, but he's even more desirous to use it. Paradox. It's not that he once felt called to do this and now he's sort of lost the desire to do it. He desires to do it ever more. And now he can't do it because he's been deprived of his vision, which means he can't read either. And he read from morning to night. And normally when writers write, they write with their own hand. He's going to dictate, which is extraordinary in itself. So arguably the greatest poem in the English language was not written. And some will say the exact same thing of Homer. Homer did not write the Odyssey, he dictated it, and somebody else wrote it down. We're not sure of that, but that's entirely plausible. So the author of the Odyssey and the Iliad did not actually do the writing. Someone else would have wrote it down. So he would have just sung it or said it from memory. Milton the same. Just think of the gift for language. It's extraordinary. But now, so it's lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my Maker. More bent, more inclined to do it. And present my true account, lest he returning chide. Milton, again, senses that God will not hold him guiltless for not doing what he felt called to do.